Hi class, welcome to your second week of remote learning. I wanted to pick up where we left off with the eagle and the raven, and I actually wanted to rewind a little bit to the beginning of chapter 2 because I wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to catch up. So in chapter 1, we learned a little bit about Sam Houston, and now we're moving on to Santa Anna. So this chapter is called Eaglet. For those of you who have started this chapter already, feel free to skip ahead a little bit, and otherwise I'll go ahead and begin. On the 21st of February, 1794, 11 months after the birth of Sam Houston in Virginia, a minor mortgage broker named Lopez, who worked in the Mexican Gulf port of Veracruz, hurried northwestward to the mountain town of Jalapa, called Jalapa with an X in official documents, where a son was being born. Veracruz was Mexico's most important seaport and the source, because of customs collected there, of much of its wealth. During the frequent revolutions that swept the country, whichever contesting power controlled the port also controlled the treasury. It was a steaming little city, one of the unhealthiest on earth, with regular plagues killing thousands each summer, and el vomito, yellow fever, attacking the rest of the time. But the city had an unquestionable charm, its stout white walls promising a safety which rarely materialized, its plazas attractive with their sturdy church facades, and its waterfront a favorite walking place, especially when breezes blew in from the sea. It provided some of the best food in the country, excellent beef from the nearby ranches, fruits of unequaled richness and variety, and all kinds of succulent seafood. It was a tropical city with great jungles reaching almost to its gates, and it was also exciting, for here the ships docked after their journey across the Atlantic, bringing news of Spain and Cuba. The streets of Veracruz were narrow, lined with tropical trees and overlooked by windows protected with handsome iron grills. The walls of the houses were mostly white, giving the city a look of cleanliness it did not merit, which means it did not deserve. Occasionally, some daring owner, usually one newly rich, would paint his house a soft blue or pink, lending a dancing color to the place. Several buildings predominated: the cathedral, the stout customs sheds along the waterfront, the arsenal where the troops lived, but above all, the gaunt fortress stuck on an island in the middle of the bay. San Juan de Ulua, it was called, with its massive walls deeply submerged in the bay itself. It constituted the most abominable prison in Christendom, worse by far than the Bastille in Paris or Newgate in London. Indeed, it competed with those even more dreadful dungeons in Constantinople or the hellholes of Samarkand. So many of Mexico's leaders would spend their formative years in San Juan de Ulua that one of the most frequent passages in Mexican biography was, after 2 years in San Juan de Ulua, he became president, or general of the armies, or governor of the treasury. This prison was the university where Mexican leaders took their advanced degrees. If the climate of Veracruz had been salubrious, the city would have been one of the adornments of the New World, the equal of Rio de Janeiro, but the health situation was so deplorable that even the most stalwart Mexican could face a life expectancy of less than 30 years if he persisted in living there. Even lesser businessmen, like Lopez, the mortgage broker, had to have a second home in the hills to which they could repair during the summer. His was in Jalapa, and there were few small towns in Mexico with more charm. It lay about 60 miles inland from Veracruz, on the extreme eastern edge of the Altiplano, an elevation which eliminated the health problems of the seaport. The doorway leading into the central courtyard of the Lopez home faced south to the glorious snow-covered Pico de Orizaba, 18,858 feet high, a perfect cone-shaped volcano rising above the jungle. Jalapa had decorative parks, winding lanes, and unexpected fountains. At dusk, People sang in the squares, and there was an air of liberation from the terrible heat of Veracruz. It was a somnolent town, and the birthplace of the broker's son, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna Perez de Lebrón, whose name certainly masked his reputed Spanish gypsy ancestry. Mexico in these turbulent years was a fascinating mix of four distinct groups. Atop the heat and by a precipitous distance stood the peninsular, born in Spain of some distinguished family of pure Spanish blood, no Moors or Jews in the background, and resident in Mexico for only a limited period while he held a senior position in the church, the army, or the government. Nicknamed a gachupin from his habit of wearing spurs reminiscent of the spurs on the legs of fighting cocks, he ran Mexico, stole as many public funds as he could, then scurried back to Spain to enrich his family. Lower in the hierarchy came the criollos, or Creoles, those of unsullied Spanish blood, but born regretfully in Mexico. They could be educated, clever, wonderful contributors to the general weal, but they could never reach a top position because they were not peninsulares. Santa Anna and his family were criollos. Next, and much larger in the number than the top two groups, came the mestizos, the half-castes or mixed ones. In these years, they were beginning to aspire to power but had not yet quite achieved it, although later the more gifted were to attain positions of considerable importance, even the presidency. At the bottom of the pecking order came the Indians, called indios. They were often quite primitive people, lacking shoes, alphabets, and leadership. But they were on the move, on the rise, and in the middle years of the century, one of their number, the great Benito Juarez, a full-blooded Indian, would set Mexico on its predestined course as a nation of majestic mixed bloods. As a criollo, halfway up the ladder of respectability, neither proud peninsular nor lowly mestizo, Santa Anna would spend his early years fighting for position. He did not spend much time in Mexico's inadequate schools. In later years, he boasted he had educated himself. He also claimed he had read only one book. Adoring biographers claimed it was Caesar's Gallic Wars. Certainly, Santa Anna had little formal education, but in its place, he acquired both an uncanny ability to sense what was going to happen next and an ability to judge what his most advantageous reaction should be. When his business-like father procured a position for him with a Veracruz merchant, he was able to sense, even at the early age of 14, that such employment was disadvantageous to his career. Santa Anna quit on the reasonable grounds that I was not born to be a counter-jumper. At a very early age, he claimed 14, records suggest 16, he enlisted in the contingent of Royal Spain's overseas army stationed in Mexico and relished the prospect of a long life of service to the king. Because he was of Spanish blood and from a family known to be gentry, he was invited into the officers' corps, where he served in the lowest rank with distinction. In later life, he described two governing principles of his life. I have since my earliest years been drawn to the glorious career of arms, feeling it to be my true vocation. And somewhat more historically, a noble sentiment, lacking all personal ambition, constantly directed all my actions, the love of liberty and the desire to glorify the name of my country. During this early period in his career, Santa Anna was, by personal conviction, a defender of Spain, a royalist, a believer in the strong central government, a devout Catholic, and one who inherently distrusted the common people, especially those of mixed or Indian blood. He was highly pleased, therefore, when in 1811 he received orders to Veracruz as a subaltern for an expedition being assembled by Colonel Joaquin Arredondo to subjugate insurrections launched in the northern provinces by Republican rebels. Such an expedition against his own people induced in Santa Anna no confusion of purpose. He said, The rabble have threatened to take arms against the king and must be disciplined. For 2 years, he campaigned in the north. With Arredondo's army, chastising rebels, shooting as many of the enemy as possible, and rounding up the rest, executing them, or sending them off whimpering to the mines. The task was made easier when the rebels had few guns, ammunition, or horses, for then the king's cavalry was free to run wild with its flashing sabers. Santa Anna, unfortunately, was in the infantry, a despicable position for a young hopeful with Spanish blood. But he behaved with such exemplary courage that early in 1812 he was recommended for a battlefield commission to second lieutenant and, on the 7th of October of that same year, promoted to first lieutenant. Next, he was promoted on merit to the cavalry, where his imaginative command of terrain and battle tactics led to many victories. One in late 1812, when he found himself leading only 30 fellow cavalrymen into a narrow gorge in which 300 Indians were well entrenched. Dismissing the option of retreat, Santa Anna led a wild charge, rampaging through the gorge, stabbing and slashing until his troop had chopped up and routed the Indians. On another occasion, it was Peninsular General Arredondo who established the pattern when he found himself faced by a disorderly mass of Republican revolutionaries who had dared to convene in an attempt to gain some of the freedoms voiced by Father Hidalgo, the little priest who in 1810 had issued his famous Grito de Dolores, the shout from the town of Dolores, which launched Mexico's fight for independence from Spain. He was executed for his efforts, but his movement resulted in Mexico's freedom in 1821. When the rebels were surrounded by Arredondo's cavalry, about half were killed outright, half the remainder were shot as prisoners, and the rest were sentenced to a life of servitude in the mines. On yet another occasion, Santa Anna and the other officers rounded up an entire village from which rebels had issued forth. After shooting most of the inhabitants, regardless of their participation, Arredondo, in the military fashion of that day, ordered the survivors sent to slavery in the buildings of a fortress. For almost 3 years, Santa Anna campaigned across northern Mexico, bringing extermination instead of justice, delivering the lash, the saber, and the bullet in place of this needed reconciliation. In late July 1813, this battle-hardened unit received word that potentially dangerous efforts of rebellion had been launched beyond the Rio Grande in the province of Texas. And with what amounted to joy, Arredondo and his men headed north, with young Santa Anna once again bent on the destruction of Indians and the subjugation of any rebels who dared question the authority of the Spanish army.